Hey everyone, welcome again to Bama Bug Fest on the Web, a virtual event dedicated to the fascinating world of insects. Bama Bug Fest on the Web is a collaborative event brought to you by UA Museums, the Warner Transportation Museum, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, the Department of Research and Collections at UA's Rogers Library, and the Tuscaloosa Public Library. We're offering 9 total days of bug-themed content that started on July 7th and will be ending next Saturday, July 25th. For a full schedule of events, you can check out our website at bamabugfest.org. Today we are talking all about moths and butterflies, and we are about to jump into a program about insect iconography with Dr. Jim Knight, Curator Emeritus of American Archaeology for the Department of Research and Collections. So hi, Dr. Knight.
Hello, good afternoon.
Thanks for joining us. So we just got off of a program that was called Butterflies Are Moths, but Moths Aren't Butterflies. And so today is just all about moths and butterflies. And we thought it would be a great way to incorporate some more of a historical element to it, not just the biology side of things. And so we thought, that's why we reached out to you and are appreciative of you spending some time and expertise with us today. So thank you so much for being here.
Glad to do it.
So as you're watching, if you have a question for us, feel free to pop it into the comments. We will be monitoring the comments and can put them up live if that's something that you would like to ask questions about as we're going through this talk today. But if you don't get a chance to put comments in right now, if you're not able to watch this live right now, don't forget that you can also continue to add comments later on, and we can get them to Dr. Knight to see if he can help us with answering them a little bit later on. So I think we should probably get started on this whole thing. And I have to ask you, probably a pretty basic question, but hopefully one that you can help me out with. And that is basically, what is iconography? So we're talking about insect iconography. And I think I have a pretty general idea of what iconography is, but I would appreciate the help if you could help me understand that term a little bit better.
Sure. So iconography is one of those iconology kind of orography words that study of something, right? And so it's the study of images and how to interpret those images. So if, for example, you're looking at a painting and the painting has some buildings and people in the painting, and you're trying to interpret what that represents, what are those buildings, who are those people, what are they doing, then you're doing iconography. That's the interpretation of icons or images. And so what I'll be doing as an iconographer is talking about prehistoric iconography, where we have lots of images from Moundville, and that requires iconographic interpretation of what is going on in these images. What are these pictures of? So that's iconography.
So is iconography, if you were to go into and learn about how to do iconography, is that an anthropology, something that's in anthropology, or is that something that's in an art department, or is it an intersection between the two, or somewhere else completely?
Iconography is something that anthropologists do, but they've sort of borrowed it from the art historians. So right now it's split, at least the kind that I do in prehistoric iconography. It's split between art historians on the one hand and anthropologists on the other, and we sort of share.
That's great. I think one of the things that, not just for this segment, but other segments in BugFest that we've come across quite a bit is that intersection of areas of study. We found that quite often, and I think it's wonderful. We get to, not everyone, you don't have to just, you get to work with lots of different people from across different departments and different fields of study, which is kind of neat. Okay, so we have a pretty, large and I think important archaeological site in our backyard here in Tuscaloosa called Moundville. I mean, there's a park there and a museum and interpretive center. And, I know if you had a chance to, if anyone of you who have been watching have ever had a chance to go into the museum, I know that you've seen some of these beautiful images that are found throughout the museum. So I'm assuming, that study of those images would be under the iconography grouping. Is what role did iconography play in that culture at Moundville?
Well, if you think of iconography as the study of something, that's what we're doing now. So if we're talking about the art itself, we're talking more or less about the icons themselves, the representations that are there, and we can talk about so the iconography of those images is trying to figure out what those artisans so many hundreds of years ago were up to. What were they trying to depict? And so we have some thoughts about that as anthropologists and archaeologists, so we can get into that. But I thought we ought to do a little bit of context work first and show a slide or so or two of Moundville and get into it that way. Can we start that way?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. Let me go ahead and get that popped up. Can you see him?
Yeah. So
is that the one right there?
Yeah, sure. Let's start right there. So Moundville is the capital town of a large society that existed on the Black Warrior River Valley in west central Alabama. And it existed between about, and these are about approximate dates, 1150 to 1520, as it says right there, AD, and that would be from about 870 to about 500 years ago. And that context, it makes a difference in the kind of iconography it is, because that's so long ago, that's so many centuries ago, that we can't simply turn to the Native American iconography of, say, a particular modern tribe and say, let's use that as our source. We'll use the beliefs and the mythology and so forth of that particular group to try to use that to interpret something that's that old, and it's not nearly that straightforward. The truth is, we don't know any particular Native American tribe that is descended from Moundville. And probably many modern tribes have some roots at Moundville, so it's not a direct relationship at all. So the iconographer's job is to look at the art itself and see what the art itself tells us in the first place about what's going on there. So Moundville artisans left us a lot to talk about. They left a lot of imagery. And some of it's engraved on pottery, and some of it's painted on pottery. Some of it's engraved on tabular stone objects. There are carved stone pipes, and there are carved stone axe heads, and embossed sheet copper artifacts, and engraved shell artifacts, and so forth. And for that matter, there's probably at Moundville an elaborate wood carving tradition, but since wood doesn't preserve in that environment in the soils, we don't know much about it at all. So what we do have, though, are hundreds of images, and so the business of iconography is to try to figure out, what those images represent. So to do that, you have to realize that this is not commonplace art. Most of what we'll be looking at, it's religious art for the most part, and then these would be things that would be handled by religious specialists, a lot of them, and so they're not really everyday kinds of things. The other aspect of it, I guess, is to try to think about Native American religious beliefs as a thing, as a kind of belief system that we ought to pay attention to when we're looking at these images. Go to the next slide, please, and let's look at that for a second. And this is pretty basic, but when we talk about Native American religion, a lot of it is based on a sort of unseen world. We have the world that's all around us of things that we see every day. And beyond that world, there's this unseen world, the beyond world, the supernatural world, and that world is inhabited by spirit beings. And the point of a religious specialist, one of the jobs of the religious specialist, what a religious specialist is good at, is sort of penetrating that boundary and going into the unseen world and trying to petition those spirits for the gifts of their power. So what are these spirits? These spirits are of all kinds. There are many of them, and Native American tribes have many stories about them. There are different ranks of spirits. There are different genders of spirits. Some of the spirits are very powerful, and some of them are less powerful. Some of them are indifferent to human beings. They act as though human beings don't exist. And others are extremely dangerous. If you contact one of these, it'll be certain death. And then yet other ones are approachable by if you know the proper ritual, you can approach them and petition them for their power. And to do that, you'd have to know the right apparatus. You'd have to have the correct artifacts. You'd have to know the proper prayers and songs and possibly dances or postures and all of the ritual apparatus that would allow you access to that other world. And so just as background there, one of the main things to know about most of the art at Moundville is that that's what it's about. Okay, Moundville art depicts spirit beings, not creatures of this world. So when you see, for example, a Moundville artifact that you think looks like a duck, well, that's not a duck, or if you see one that looks like an insect, well, it's an insect-like spirit. It's not one of the insects that we see in the ordinary world around us. It's not simply a picture of that, right? It is almost always something that's there because a religious practitioner was petitioning that particular spirit for its power. Many of them look like birds and insects and so forth and reptiles, but they're not. You can't take out your Peterson's guide, as a friend of mine likes to say, and try to look up what these creatures are, because they're not in the Peterson guide. Right. You can spend all day trying to figure out what the butterfly images are really, what species they're based off of. Right. Yeah. But they are based on the natural world, because that's what the artisan knows about, right? So you'll see parts and parts of images that are at least vaguely familiar to you. But you'll see a lot of things that are simply pretty bizarre and not familiar at all in the natural world, and that's the way to kind of explain all of that. So it's with that I can show you some pictures of what apparently are insects.
That's great. I think it's an important distinction, I think, to realize. I guess it's not something that I even really think of all the time when I go into the museum and see all of the depictions, that they are of spirit realm and not necessarily physical realm things. And so it's nice to keep that in mind. It's very good to keep in mind. So kind of hold your thoughts on what particular species of beetle you think you may be looking at when you. And by the way, insect representations at Moundville are very rare, and so I've only got 3 to show you. Okay. And, there are a few more, but these are the presentable ones, and one of them's not all that presentable. So, okay. So why don't we just start by? I'm going to show you 3 objects. Okay. Okay. And we'll just talk about each one in turn, and then we'll go back to them and give you better. I'll give you better illustrations of what they're showing, because the real objects don't necessarily show up very well. So what's next? What do we have next first? Okay, here's a pot. This is a Moundville water bottle. And there you see a very formal black and white picture taken of it back in 1979. That's its catalog number. NG means it's found near, just north of Mound G, and that's when you're going to Moundville and just cross the railroad tracks coming into the park. The biggest mound you're looking at in front of you is Mound G. So this is found just north of that, it's the top of it is discolored and a little bit hard to, well, the whole thing is hard to see because the engraving is so fine. It's on blackware, and engraved lines on blackware are very fine lines and very hard to see. But this vessel is one of the very few at Moundville that people have said over the years depicts what looks like an insect. And I'll show you a picture of that later. And so you can just sort of barely see what I'm talking about engraved on there, and we'll see a picture of it later and talk about it in some more detail. But let's go to the next one. This one's more famous, and this one is
called the Willoughby Disc, and the original is in the Harvard Peabody Museum. Actually, the Moundville Museum had the original of this for many months, but recently the Harvard wanted it back, and so they had to send it back. It's a disc, and it's made of shale, and it's locally made. We have to say that when we talk about Moundville artifacts, because many of them are not locally made; they're imported from somewhere else. But this one's local, and it's done in the local style. And we see various elements of Moundville art that are found in other artifacts at Moundville. There's a row of there's two skulls mounted on what looks like a sort of twisted rope or something occupying the middle, and then there's two hands off to the side. Yeah, and with that, what's been called the hand and eye design, but that's wrong. And then we probably don't have time to talk about all that. But below that is what we call the bilobed arrow emblem. There, it's an arrow basically, but it has two lobes off to the side. And the thing on the left is what we'll mainly be talking about, whatever that is. That pineapple on top of whatever it is, you know.
Right.
So the thing is made of shale, and the surface is very spalled off, and so you see bits and pieces that are missing from the design. And one thing I want to point out right now, before we get any further, is the circle and dot emblem on the left hand side, the large one there. That's all spalled off around that. No, below where your cursor is there. Not that one, but the one on the far left.
Oh.
In my screen anyway. I can't point.
Sorry.
No. Okay. The other side of the tab, other side of the ballot there.
Over here?
Below there, just below there.
That one.
There. Bingo.
Sorry.
all around that, if you have the real thing and you look at it with a 10 power loop like I have done, it's all spalled off, and so we're missing part of the design right there, and that's important because we'll try to complete that part of the design here in a minute. But this is the Willoughby Disc. It's one of a few fancy objects like this that are decorated like this. But palettes are more common. There are about 50 palettes like this that are circular, that have notches around them. And what they're used for is that on the back side of this thing, which is actually the top side, things were mixed. Medicines were mixed, paints were mixed, various kinds of magical substances and important ritual substances were mixed on the back of this thing, almost like a portable altar. And these things we know were kept in bundles, and we know that because we can see the actual sort of impression or faint impression of the bundles on many of them at both Moundville and some other sites. And so these things we think were kept in sacred bundles and were used by priests. And again, these priests are spiritual practitioners who know how to contact this unseen world, and this is whatever it means. That's what this is all about: contacting that unseen world. So this is a fairly famous artifact. So the interpretation of this comes in a little while. So next.
Okay.
Now this is a bottle, another Moundville bottle. This one is red painted, and it has a white painted design on top of the red, and it has some of the same elements that were on that Willoughby disc on it. Mm-hmm. And this is much more simplified, but we're going to make a connection here between this bottle and the Willoughby disc here just in a minute. So those are the three artifacts that I have for you to talk about. And so let's go back and talk about them in a little bit more detail. And so we can go to the next slide, and we'll give you some illustrations. Sorry. Yeah, there. Okay. There's that first bottle again, and there's a line drawing of the designs that are on it. And there are two. And one occupies one whole side, and the other is on the other side. So there's one sort of one side, one on each side. As you can see, they're kind of alike, except they're kind of different too. There are differences in them. We think they're made by the same artist, engraved by the same artist. So the question here is, what are we looking at? Well, I have to go back and say, whatever you see here, it's probably a spirit being, not a real insect, but people have said for a long time that these look like insects. So what do you think? What do you think those are? If those were based on insects from the natural world. As soon as as soon as you choose, by the way, you run up against issues of things that don't match. But you know,
right.
But
I mean,
go ahead.
I can't help but think that they look a little bit like butterflies or moths.
Okay, that's valid. Other people have said, you know, they look more like beetles because of the fat body, and in fact,
Oh,
you know,
yeah, absolutely.
and the one on the right anyway,
Because the double wing
has that sort of double wing. You know how a beetle will sort of, it has a hard case shell and it opens that up and the wings are under it and come out.
Yeah.
So some other people have said beetle, but frankly, as an iconographer, I don't know what that is. I just have no idea. But there it is. It's pretty unique at Moundville. I don't know of any other pottery vessel at Moundville among many dozens that are engraved in this style that have this. So whatever it is, it's important enough to have a ritual meaning. And if it's not insects, I don't know what it is. You know,
it does
based on insects.
It definitely does look insect in origin. You know, it definitely looks like it's based off of an insect of some sort.
Yeah, those things that it looks like it has a head, and it looks like maybe those are antennae that are coming up from it.
Right.
As opposed to, what else could that be? Horns, maybe, but I think more antenna would be viable.
Yeah.
So that is some ancient artist's interpretation of a spirit being, insect-based, we think. So
it's beautiful.
Yeah, and so maybe some of the viewers out there will have some better ideas about what we're looking at.
Yeah. But
we can go on. Let's move on to the next one, which will be the Willoughby Disc again, because that's more complicated. This is the line drawing of that palette that I showed you earlier. Mm-hmm. So again, the elements there are the central sort of bundle of rope-like thing that goes from top to bottom. There are two skulls on it, and the hand and eye designs they're double. And by the way, if you've seen an interpretation of the hand and eye that says that it is a constellation in the sky, this throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into that, because there are two side by side. It looks like both hands are represented. And then below that and overlapping the fingers just a little bit is that bilobed arrow. And then there's that element off to the left that we're going to be talking about. Scholars kind of left that alone, you know, held that 10 feet away for years and years and years and just sort of refused to interpret that. One analyst thought it looked just like sort of skillful doodling, but it's not doodling. It has a religious purpose, like everything else on the palette. And we have to assume that it was of equal importance, at least to what else was there. Other people have said it looked like a bit of fabric, or you know, just an odd assemblage of characteristics. Some people said the bottom part of it that's spiked there and curls, that might be a conch shell symbol. And people were just sort of specialists were not sure at all what that was. And so a friend of mine, Judith Frank, who formerly worked for the Dixon Mound Museum in Illinois, she and I both came up with the same idea more or less at once. So we joined forces and wrote an academic article about this thing and tried to figure it out, basically. So we turned it on its side and compared it to some other things, and we came up with a comparison, which is, I think, on the next slide. Okay, so there it is on the bottom. And what I've done in the picture is I've filled in the part with dotted lines that's broken off. I've given it a jagged edge. It didn't necessarily have a jagged edge, but anyway, we think it's closed. Okay. So those are two overlapping fan-like devices. Okay, at the top. Yeah. And so comparing it to the picture above, and that's another archaeological object that comes from Northwest Georgia, and that's more readily identifiable as an insect-like thing, right?
Yeah.
And a long, large proboscis that sticks out from the top, and the head is reduced to a kind of just the eye,
Right.
And then we have the segmented body, which ends in a kind of fishtail-like thing. And then the sort of overlapping wings on the back. And we compared that with the image on the Willoughby Disc and said, that sure looks like the same thing in two different art styles. And so we went from there. And so that became a moth supernatural or butterfly supernatural. We're not being very specific about that. But
right.
if you look back at if you look down at the Willoughby Disc image there, you see what the head is again reduced to just the eye. Then you have a segmented body ending in that forked tail device. And entomologists say that when you have a forked tail like that, it indicates that it's a male. I didn't know that when we started out. But then we have the overlapping wings that are decorated with dots, and at least one of them has a sort of jagged edge. Now moving, and you notice they're overlapped in an interesting way. So that the back one is actually overlapping in both cases the front one. So what about that's out in front of the eye? On the Willoughby Disc, that fringe-like element that comes, not that, but the one, that thing, it corresponds on the one from Georgia with something that looks a whole lot more like antenna coming straight up out of the eye. That thing. Okay, I can see antenna there. So the corresponding thing on the Willoughby Disc might be some sort of short, stubby antenna-like device. And then on both, we have that curly spiked element, which then becomes, with the moth interpretation, the proboscis.
Right.
All right. Right. Which has this long curled proboscis. Now.
Yeah.
One interesting thing too is that the way those wings are depicted says something about butterfly versus moth, right? Because moths have their wings rest in a different position than butterflies do.
Right.
Right. So this would suggest butterfly, right? Because it has if this is to be meant to be at rest, the wings are upright, and the lowermost wing is actually overlapping the front wing, which is how it looks when you look at a butterfly with its wings at rest, stationary. So anyway, this was back in 1993. We came up with the notion that this was some sort of moth or butterfly, Lepidopteran, I guess, based supernatural.
Yeah.
And it's rare at Moundville. It exists on very, very, very few artifacts. And it exists at least partially on, let's see what the next slide is. There's that bottle again. Yeah. And there we have a dotted wing that has a sort of serrated edge to it that's similar to what we saw on both of the other artifacts, one from Northwest Georgia and from Moundville, and also that something that resembles that long proboscis. Yeah. And so what we think this bottle is doing is showing us a part for the whole, a pars pro toto version of this moth supernatural being. Without showing us the whole creature, they're giving us enough indications to figure it out. Right. Like giving us the proboscis in both and the wing on both sides. And there are very, very few bottles like this, and none in fact that are done in red and white paint like this at Moundville that have this image. This is the only one, and it came from Mound C, and and on the north end of the park. So those are the three things. And go to the next slide then, please. All right. So the next thing, the next instinctual thing you'd want to do is say, well, what kinds of butterflies and moths have rounded emblems or rounded elements on their wings and have a sort of serration effect on the outer margin? And one answer is this. This is a common buckeye butterfly. It's not perfect, the analogy here, but but at least this is one common butterfly that has that.
Yeah, you can see the elements though. I mean, I can
Yeah.
see what you're talking about. Yeah.
You see the serrations down on especially on the lower wings there. At least those kinds of things. They're not exactly what the artisan showed us, but at least that's a possibility.
Right.
So there's one, and we could go on, going through the butterfly book and checking this or that or the other species to see if there's a better match. But ultimately, that's pretty hopeless, because we always come back to the notion that we're not going to find it. We're not going to find it because it's a supernatural being. It's not of this world. So it's intentionally different, right?
Right.
So anyway, let's go to the next slide. So now the question is, what role did this butterfly or moth supernatural play in the ancient Mississippian world, 700 or 800 years ago? And this is not from Moundville. This is an engraved shell gorget from northwest Georgia, and it shows a being. And so this is a supernatural being again. You can tell it's not somebody dressed up in a costume, because just by looking at the feet, right? Because the feet are bird feet.
Yeah.
And the nose is not a normal human nose. This is a sort of a bird human figure. And it's in a sort of dancing posture. So we some people say it's dancing. It's at least in the kind of posture that might be dancing, because one leg is up to one side, and the other leg is curled tightly up under it, so you can just barely see the other foot tucked under it there. And so this thing is wearing a sort of diaper-like decorated loin device. It has a sash with a knot, with parts of the sash hanging down behind one side. It's wearing a beaded necklace, and it has a conch shell, inverted conch shell at the center of that necklace is the centerpiece. It has a 3-part headdress, and we could talk about that if we wanted to, what that is all about. It is a winged being. The wing is shown in profile on one side. And but we're interested here in what it's holding. In one hand, it's got a flint sword, and we know that's a sword. That thing is a flint sword, and we know that's true because there are actually several of these things, and we have the actual flint swords that we find that are found archaeologically, and they match that profile. And so that's what that is. This being is holding a flint sword in one hand, and grasped in the other hand is our moth, or is our moth butterfly, supernatural. It's being held by the proboscis in the other hand, and just sort of hanging down. The body goes behind the leg of the creature that's holding it, but you see sort of all the rest of it there. You see the forked tail going behind.
That's the tail right there.
Yeah, that's the tail going behind the leg of the creature that's holding it.
Yeah.
So most experts most specialists that have looked at this artifact from northwest Georgia think that it's a posture of hostility or attack. In other words, the moth creature is being attacked or by somebody brandishing this flint sword. That's one interpretation. And in fact, Professor Kent Riley, who's been on the Moundville Mondays broadcast from the museum at least twice recently, that's his interpretation. It's a valid one. And that's much in line with what a lot of people have said, but I want to point out another way of looking at this thing. And that is that if we think of this as a super powerful supernatural being that's important enough to wear on a gorget, and by the way, a gorget is something that's drilled for suspension. You wear it on your chest, and that's what this is. Then if it's that important, it's showing us something about its powers. And what are its powers? Well, it has a chert knife on the one side, but maybe the way to look at this is to say it's holding two of its most important powers in its hands. One would be the power of warfare, some emblem of warfare, the chert sword, and the other thing would be whatever it is this this other supernatural being and all of its associations. So it would be, instead of attacking one with the sword, it could be seen as dancing in a dancing posture and holding up both of its power objects. So what in the world then would the power object be that would have as its emblem this moth supernatural? And our Native American friends back in the 90s came to the rescue here and suggested something that's interesting. And let's go to the next slide. That's a Sphinx moth, otherwise known as rock moth. They're nocturnal, and they go around sticking their extremely long proboscis, like this one is doing, down, and that's its feeding tube, down into a deep flower, and collecting the nectar. And what it's doing there is it's pollinating the tobacco plant. And one of the most ritually important plants to the Native Americans of the Southeast, in fact all of North America, is tobacco, because tobacco is one of the key substances by which religious specialists using the tobacco, smoking the tobacco, use it to communicate with that world, that beyond world, that unseen world. So here's an extremely important ritual plant, and here's its pollinator. This moth with a long proboscis that hums around like a hummingbird at night, and it has these nocturnal associations, and so there might be a night and day aspect to this supernatural. But our Native American friends seized on this immediately. Now it doesn't match the style of the wings of the creature at Moundville, but we wouldn't expect it to, right?
Right.
We wouldn't expect everything on there to be just a sort of literal Sphinx moth on Moundville artifacts. But I like this. I like the moth creature or butterfly creature as being an emblem of the power of tobacco to reach this for the religious practitioner to use to reach the other world, to communicate with the spirit world beyond using tobacco. What better emblem of tobacco than to use the animal that pollinates it? It's hard, after all, to draw tobacco itself.
Right.
So I like this. This is a Native American informant telling us that what they think this is, and I think if that's not it, I like it anyway. I like it's on the right track, I think.
Right. Yeah.
To interpreting why we have a moth creature and what role it plays, what it's all about there. So you can flip back to the previous slide. If that's right, then what this creature has in its hand is not, he's not trying to attack the moth. The moth is in a ritually very important means of communicating with that other world. He's just holding there two emblems of power, one of which is tobacco, and the other is some sort of emblem, probably of warfare, and not literal warfare, but maybe sort of supernatural warfare. And about that, I won't speculate anymore. But that's at least one role that our moth creature could play. Our friend Professor Riley at Texas calls the being Mothra after the Japanese monster in the Godzilla movies, but that's just a joke, and it's just a way to talk about it. It's a little nickname that he's given it, but that's okay. We can have nicknames for it. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah, those are the that's what we have from Moundville for insect iconography. It's not a lot to talk about, but that's it.
I think it's I know that it wasn't a lot to talk about, but I think it seems like I know I kind of like that it took a lot of people to help to sort of put together a possible story of it. It wasn't just iconographers, but it was also people from, the Native American communities. Sure. and that like storytelling tradition or not even just storytelling tradition, but just their culture in general is kind of interesting to have that everyone work together to try to figure out what it is. And that the tobacco one, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It really does, considering if tobacco was such an important plant, to that spiritual person's in their
I like it.
tools.
I like it. And one way to think about that is you've got all of this religious imagery. We know that tobacco was important anyway. Pipes are extremely important in many Mississippian cultures, including Moundville, smoking pipes. And so we know they're using pipes to communicate with the other world. Any religious specialists are doing that. We know how important they are ritually. So why wouldn't there be some emblem of tobacco somehow? Just like there should be an emblem. We should expect to find an emblem of the sun and the moon and some other things. We should expect to find an emblem of tobacco. I think this is a pretty good candidate.
Now, I just want to make sure, so this imagery that we're talking about is, again, if this is a silly question, I'm sorry, but just to make sure, it's a separate from like a system of writing, or, it's not just writing day-to-day activities. Like you said, this is imagery to depict religious or for religious purposes, right?
Yes, that's people ask all the time, are images like this at Moundville and other sites like this, is that a kind of writing? And the technical answer is no, it's not. It's not like hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt, where that actually represents a language, a spoken language, where the elements of the hieroglyphics in the Egyptian case represent sounds that come out of your mouth. That's not what this is. And in fact, it's not even picture writing in the sense that it doesn't convey a narrative all by itself.
Right.
So it communicates, but not like that. It communicates by being an emblem of something.
That's okay. So maybe that wasn't such a silly question. I'm glad I asked.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I think that it seems like a lot of people have really enjoyed and thought it was very interesting and wanted to say thank you. I'm sure that, we've come across them. I know that I've come across some of this imagery, going through the museum myself, and now I'm going to look at it in a whole new light. So I appreciate that. There was one question I had, though, actually, now that I go back to it. Nick, you said something about the items that were found, how few of them were made on site, but a lot of them were imported or brought in. Do we know much about like how that happened? Is that a trade thing, or is it just some people came to visit and they were left there, or do we know anything about those or how that worked?
Well, one of the biggest jobs for archaeologists is kind of figure out where things are made. There are, for example, pipes made of limestone that depict panthers that are found. Several have been found at Moundville, but none of those were made at Moundville because that panther imagery, for one thing, is a kind of imagery that's native to the lower Mississippi River Valley, not Moundville. And the other thing is they're made of a kind of limestone called Glendon limestone that outcrops near Vicksburg, Mississippi. So we know where those came from. So now we have to figure out what place did they have in the Moundville religious system. So we have to when we're looking at something that's found at Moundville, it's not necessarily something that originated at Moundville, and that's a very important distinction to make. There are lots of things at Moundville that got there. Your question about how it got there is an important one. If you go to the Moundville Museum now, the first thing you see when you come in the door of the Moundville Museum is a scene of a wedding. That wedding depicts the wedding of a local Moundville chief, and the chief's family is shown, to a foreign lady. This lady is arriving from the lower Mississippi Valley, and all of the artifacts that she's bringing, the bride wealth there that's shown all around, those are not Moundville artifacts. Those are illustrations of artifacts that come from another style zone, another different area. So, that's marriage would be just one good example of how things like that would start out in one part of the United States and end up somewhere entirely different, as being given as bride wealth gifts for to seal treaties, or as given as gifts in mourning when someone important dies, weddings, events like this, things get given away. Okay.
Well, it's good. Now, I know that, you've worked a lot in Moundville in the area. Do you study iconography in any other region of the United States? Are there other insects that are insect-based images that you're aware of that are from different parts of the country?
Well, sure. There's a really interesting one that Dr. Riley showed in one of those Moundville Monday broadcasts the other day. It's a painted mural in a kiva, which is a ceremonial room, an underground ceremonial room that's round in the Pueblo area of the southwestern United States, and that depicts what, for all the world, looks like our sort of Moth supernatural character. It even has the same kind of wings, has this long curling proboscis coming out for a nose. But that one is anthropomorphic. It's got many human elements that the ones from Moundville and Northwest Georgia don't seem to have. But yeah, there's but there and looking around, and the folklorists can address this a whole lot better than I can. But in the folklore and in mythology and beliefs of various Native American groups all over the present United States, insects feature in all sorts of roles.
That's great. Well, thank you. I think that we've covered quite a bit of insect iconography, both at Moundville and around. So I think maybe this might be a good place to wrap it up. Do you have any parting thoughts or final words that you want to leave everyone with?
Stay safe and stay cool.
Yeah, we were just talking about the heat earlier today. It is warm. Yes. So I would like to thank you all again for joining us for Bama Bug Fest on the web today. Make sure to check us out tonight at 7 for our daily wrap up, and then again on Tuesday, July 21st for our Pollinators Day. Content always appears at 10 to 4 and at 7, and all times are Central Standard Times. If you aren't able to join us in for the live presentations at the time that they happen, you can always go back and watch them later through archived videos on our social media sites and YouTube channels, and with our handy resource guide. Make sure to like and subscribe to all of our partners' social media pages and channels. And for a full schedule of events, you can find, or please visit bamabugfest.org. It has all of the information that you need about the event and what's happening. As always, we want to thank our collaborating partners for making this event happen. And we would like to thank you, Dr. Knight, for joining us today, giving us a little bit of time and your expertise and sharing that with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
And we are, I'm going to link in the comments this great segment that was done on our Museums from Your Home series, which happened from March until May, of some storytelling from this wonderful storyteller that spoke with people at Moundville. There is a story, from what I understand, involving a moth, but it's not one that I'm familiar with. And not one that is told in this storytelling segment, but it does tell a great story that does involve crayfish. I hear that they're crayfish when you study them, but crawfish when you eat them. So I guess we'll decide which one that is. But it does depict or does involve crayfish in the story. And we have, for our Bama Bug Fest this year, we are talking about all bugs, which are most arthropods. And so wanted to make sure that you guys had access to that. So check out in the comments. I will post that in a second. Make sure you get a chance to watch that video because it's got some wonderful, wonderful interviews and stories in there. But for now, I guess I'd just like to say, see you all next time on Bama Bug Fest on the web, and we hope that you have a great day. Bye.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.